Okay, I know what you're probably thinking. John, it's the end of August. It's not time for Halloween. Guess what? Shut up. It's always the time for Halloween. Hey, what's up? My name is John Bonjour. I am an artist and a film enthusiast, and this is kind of going to be a different video for me. Normally, I do movie reviews. This one, I just want to do something that I'm passionate about. I love horror. It's probably my favorite genre of film, so I want to start talking about it more. I don't know. Maybe this won't work. Maybe no way to watch this. Who cares? My goal for this video, I am fully aware that horror is an insane kind of world of film to jump into. There are so many subgenres and so many, terrible movies, if we're being honest, that it's, kind of daunting to get into. So that's what I want to do with this video. I want to be your guide, ease you into the waters of horror. All right, let's dive in. So the way this is going to work, I've got 6 different kind of subgenres of horror, and I'm going to give you one that I think everybody has to see and one kind of deep cut. And I'll give a few words on why. Right off the top, my favorite genre of horror is slasher. The whole point is that there's a killer in a mask and they're going around killing people. And if that doesn't sound like your kind of thing, it's probably not. There's not a lot else to it. It's just people in masks going around killing people. And I find that tremendous. I genuinely think that the perfect kind of encapsulation of the slasher genre is Friday the 13th, Part 4. That's the final chapter is what they call it. You'll notice that a lot in horror movies as you're kind of going in. They always say oh, this is the last Nightmare on Elm Street, and then there's 4 more after. In this particular case, there are 12 total Friday the 13th movies. Don't get me started, I know it's ironic. But this is part 4, where they kind of thought the series was ending. It came out in 1984, and it's directed by Joseph Zito. I think what's so great about this movie is that it has it all. It's got the annoying teens. It's got Jason in his hockey mask going around killing them. This is where the franchise kind of found the footing that it would use for the rest of the movies and honestly kind of set a tone for the genre as a whole. But it's also not so far into the story and the lore and just the production of these movies that it stops trying. A couple of the ones later on, especially in the Friday the 13th, just sort of stopped trying. Part 4 feels like they really wanted to end on a bang. Of course, it didn't end, but it's a great movie. It's got everything you'd want in a slasher movie with none of the self-awareness that you get later on. Now, your deep cut slasher, if you really want to just bare bones, watch the Friday the 13th movie and probably a couple of the other ones, you'll get the gist. But if you want to dive in deep, my recommendation is Sleepaway Camp. It came out in 1983 and it's directed by Robert Hiltzik. I'm just going to get ahead of it. This is a weird movie. It's definitely a slasher. It's set at this summer camp, kind of a recurring thing for these movies. I won't even say it's particularly well made, but the ending of this movie has stuck with me for years. That's all I'll say. Enjoy at your own risk. All right, genre 2, creature features. We're talking monsters, aliens, werewolves, some kind of fish creature. There are so many options. It was really hard to narrow down. I could do so many of these videos, but I think the most important one, the prime creature feature movie, is The Thing, directed by John Carpenter, came out in 1982. Most notable aspect of this movie, the effects are incredible. This has some of the best practical monster effects that I have ever seen to this day. Not to mention, it also really nails that kind of just uncomfortable feeling. There's a lot of paranoia to this movie. It's set in the Arctic, love a good creature with some snow, and it comes in at, I think, 92 minutes. It's pretty short, to the point. It has some classic scenes that are referenced a lot. It's just one of the all-time great movies, not to mention horror movies. Your deep cut on creature feature, guys, I'm so sorry. I feel bad recommending some of these movies because if you're just getting into horror and you're just getting into these movies the whole point is to push boundaries, right? It doesn't always just stop at scary things. Sometimes there's just some of the weirdest stuff in these movies. And this is a beautiful example. Brain Damage, directed by Frank Henenlotter. This came out in 1988. You'll notice a lot of 80s movies, just a prime time for horror. This was when they cared. This was when it was really going, It was also before a lot of people were able to process trauma. So you didn't have a lot of the elevated horror of oh, this monster represents depression. No, it was just what's scary? A monster. What else is scary? I don't know, dads. What do you mean? What do you mean it has another meaning? It's just a big weird monster. I am telling you, this is one of the strangest movies. I don't even know how to describe it other than just weird alien parasite. It's also very funny. There's a weird sardonic through line that you don't get in a lot of things. I love this movie. Blanket statement, honestly, for all of my deep cut movies. It might not be your thing. Some of these, it wasn't my thing, and then I just kept watching it, and then it became my thing. I'm not sure quite what that is, but it's happened a lot to me. I'm sure that's normal. That's normal, right? You guys do that? My next genre for you, zombie movies. Now, I separated this from creature features. There's just so many zombie movies, and I think they're kind of their own thing. There's a lot of tropes that come with them. You'll start to pick up on them as you see a lot more of them. You know the basics. Somebody dies, there's usually some sort of virus, they come back to life, zombie. This is also separated from a possession movie, which sometimes has some kind of crossovers. We'll get to that in a minute. The ultimate zombie movie, the one that everybody has to see, 1968's Night of the Living Dead, directed by George Romero. Once again, I can hear your thoughts. It sounds old, it's black and white. I know what you're looking for is probably the gore, the zombies, the biting, all of that. I understand. I get that there's an appeal to all the gore. Don't get me wrong, I love the gory movies. But there is something about this movie that is so deeply unsettling if you genuinely choose to interact with it. I think a lot of these movies, pretty much any horror movie, if you just sort of, throw it on, if you just watch it, it might not work. It doesn't really, it requires some investment. But especially with this movie, if you choose to really dive into it and turn down the lights, maybe get a little popcorn, really make a thing of it and focus on the movie. Don't check Instagram, just watch the movie. It is so rewarding. All of these are. They give back as much as you can possibly put in. This is absolutely no exception. It's one of my favorite movies. This is not a hot take. It's the granddaddy of the zombie movies, and it is still incredible to this day. On to deep cut zombie movie. One that a lot of people probably don't know because it's weird and Italian. Lucio Fulci's Zombie Flesh Eaters from 1979. This is also sometimes called Zombie 2. Not sure why. There's some kind of release thing. Anyway, this is an Italian zombie movie. Italian horror, by the way. There's a whole other section of giallo horror. It's so good. The Italians have got something going for them in terms of horror. Zombie Flesh Eaters, there's a lot I could say about it. It has some really incredible practical effects. But if I could sum it up in just one kind of concept, shark versus zombie. What more could you possibly want? Okay, genre number 4, possession. So we're talking demons. Sometimes it kind of blends in with ghosts, but I limit it mostly to demons because that's where most of the possession comes in. Prime possession movie, Evil Dead 2, directed by Sam Raimi. It came out in 1987. If this takes off, I will probably do a whole series of videos on the Evil Dead franchise because I love it. I love it so much. It's so good. But the reason I say start with Evil Dead 2 is because Evil Dead 1 is an incredible movie, but it's very, very, very low budget. That's what works so well about it, but it also can be kind of off-putting. It became popular, and then Sam Raimi got the money for Evil Dead 2 off the back of Evil Dead 1, and pretty much remade Evil Dead 1 and then folded in some new story beats for Evil Dead 2. So that's where I'd recommend starting with the franchise. I think it tells the story of Evil Dead 1 probably a little bit better, although a little more tongue-in-cheek. Evil Dead 2 is definitely more on the side of horror comedy. Evil Dead 1 leans straight forest horror pretty hard. The thing that works so great about this movie is Sam Raimi, if you don't know, he directed the original Spider-Man trilogy, Drag Me to Hell, a couple other things, Darkman, I think. His direction style is so unique. It's very cartoonish, but sometimes when you mix that with this evil demonic force that he's working with in these movies, it's just magic. And for your deep cut possession movie, House of the Devil, directed by Ty West, came out in 2009. I almost hesitate to call this a possession movie because you don't see a ton of the possession, but it's definitely a demonic possession kind of movie, and it's insane. Of all of the movies on this list, I think this is the one that's the biggest risk. You really might not like this movie. I wouldn't say that it's scary. That does feel kind of weird to say about a horror movie, but a lot of horror movies aren't particularly horrifying. They're just dark and creepy and fun. That's where I think House of the Devil really lives, and I think it's great in that. Also, for coming out in the 2000s, it very intentionally feels much more like a late 70s, early 80s kind of movie. So there's not a ton of effects, but when they're used super great, and there's just this building dread through the whole thing that I think is incredible. For our next genre, I chose ghosts. Now, zombies, ghosts, and demonic possession have this weird Venn diagram where there's a lot of shared similarities, but I think ghosts are worth mentioning because they're their own kind of thing. And they create a very different atmosphere than a demonic movie does, where demonic horror kind of leans in the reveling in evil and darkness. Ghosts are sometimes that, but sometimes they're also just kind of misunderstood. There's a lot more to play with in that. Full honesty, neither of these choices are really all that deep a cut. Nobody's gonna be blown away if you've watched these movies. Nobody's gonna be like, oh, you really know your stuff. These are like bare bones horror movies, but I think they're worth watching. First off, we have The Ring, directed by Gore Verbinski. It came out in 2001. This one is an outlier. I think this might be the only PG movie. Check me on that. I'm not sure about Night of the Living Dead. Either way, I think this is the only PG-13 movie on this list. And most of the time, PG-13 horror, it just isn't able to go as far as you really need a horror movie to go. I think there's a couple of good exceptions. This one really stands out. This was the second horror movie I ever watched, and it terrified me. There's one specific shot that really, I remember where I was when I saw that shot. This movie is great. You get so caught up in the character and the story and solving the mystery that sometimes you kind of forget that it's a horror movie, and that's right when it hits you. Second up for ghostly horror, Stanley Kubrick's 1980 classic, The Shining. Obviously, it's based on the book The Shining, written by Stephen King. Loosely based. There are some comparisons. It's not really based on that book. This is also a movie that you really have to choose to invest yourself in. I watched it with a film studies class and they all thought it was hilarious, but I had watched it alone and it was terrifying. So it really just depends on who you see it with and what kind of energy you have in the room. If you have the right energy and headspace going in, this is one of the most unsettling horror movies out there. Like, it really gets under your skin and just kind of lives there. It's also just a classic film, so worth watching in that regard alone. Last up on our genres list, horror comedy. Now, I mentioned this earlier on. Horror comedy is such a weird blend. Once again, you find this Venn diagram where laughter is surprising and horror is surprising, but it's a really weird feeling when something happens and it makes you feel both. As much as they have an overlap, they are very separate feelings, and the combination of those is something truly spectacular. It's also something that so many people try to do and completely fail at. So there's a lot of really, really, really bad horror comedies. One of the most famous and my personal favorite, Shaun of the Dead, directed by Edgar Wright, came out in 2004. What makes this movie so specifically funny is Edgar Wright's direction. His quick pacing and great visual gags are what make this thing work. The whole first 10 or 20 minutes of this film follow our protagonist walking around completely, absolutely unaware that the zombie apocalypse is starting behind him. The whole time, the tension is just rising and rising and rising because you know eventually he's gonna figure it out. And then when it finally boils over, the rest of the movie is hilarious, yes, but one of the best zombie movies out there. Your deep cut for horror comedy, Slither, directed by James Gunn, came out in 2006. James Gunn you'll probably recognize from directing the Guardians of the Galaxy movies, and now he's about to take on the DC universe as a whole. But this is really where his roots are. It's a weird, gross horror movie about a bunch of slug aliens trying to take over the world. I can't recommend this movie highly enough. I think it just hits all the right buttons without ever going too long or feeling like it's drawn out. There you go. There's your starter pack for horror movies. If you want to see base level and deep cut, watch through this list. Tell me what you think. I've really enjoyed making this, so if you want another starter pack, I would love to make it. Also, if your favorite movie isn't on here, probably there's a reason. The next couple of months for me are going to be pretty full of horror movies, and then hopefully a couple more videos like this. I've already got the idea for Halloween starter pack, so keep an eye out for that. Thank you for watching this video and checking out my channel. If you'd like to hear more of my thoughts on horror movies, romantic comedies, pens, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, comment down below what you want me to review next and what you think of this video idea. Or do none of that. I'm not your dad.